The boarding pass was torn from his hand before Jordan even had time to blink. A cold, ripping sound sliced through the stillness of the first-class cabin, like a cut straight into the pride of a man who had spent his entire life standing firm in rooms where every pair of eyes defaulted to doubting him. Linda Hawkins inspected the ticket as if it were a cheap counterfeit slip, her lips pressing together with a contempt so poorly concealed it was almost blatant. "I will ask one last time," her voice sharpened like metal. "Where did you get this ticket?" First class fell silent. No one breathed deeply. No one moved. Only the thick diamond cold tension seemed to drop across every row. Jordan's eyes lowered for a measured second before he raised them again, slow, controlled, as if he were fighting to keep every thread of emotion from bursting outward. But beneath that calm veneer, the heat of humiliation was already beginning to rise. Slowly, wave after wave, a silent storm only he could hear. Jordan Mitchell, 43 years old, CEO of LifeCore Medical Systems, one of the pioneering medical tech companies creating mobile dialysis devices for low-income patients. A man who had climbed out of a childhood of scarcity in South Philly to build a medical empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A technical prodigy whose eyes remembered every crack in the world. Yet here he was being looked at by Linda as if he were someone trying to sneak into a place he did not belong. The entire first-class cabin felt like it was standing on the edge of a cliff. One misstep and the truth would shatter open. Jordan felt the silence digging into his spine, like claws, a silence that judged that sided with the powerful a silence society had carried for far too long, long enough for people like Linda to believe they had the right to decide who deserved to sit in the front row and who didn't. A breath escaped Jordan's chest, neat and cold. "My ticket," he said, his voice low, but sharp, "was purchased directly from the airline 3 weeks ago." A simple sentence, yet its weight struck Linda like a blow. She raised an eyebrow, a thin, almost poisonous challenge. "Is that so?" She held the ticket to the light, tilting and twisting it, as if staring long enough would make it confess it did not belong to Jordan, as if his presence itself was a system error. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman narrowed his eyes, not out of sympathy for Jordan, but because he was surprised this was happening so openly. He knew everyone in the cabin knew that this was not about checking a ticket. This was an invisible test people of color had to pass every time they stepped into a premium space, the test of proving they deserved to be there. A camera inside Jordan's mind recorded every detail, the contempt in Linda's eyes, the slight flinch of the passenger in front of him, the half-beat quickening of his own heart. This was not about a piece of paper. It was about hierarchy, power, and assumption, the deeply rooted belief that success had a color. Linda's voice hardened. "I will ask again. Who are you?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a declaration, a reminder that she believed she had the authority to determine who belonged in first class. Jordan did not respond immediately. He felt every gaze surrounding him, curious, startled, uneasy, and from farther back the looks of people who understood all too well what was happening but did not want to get involved. Eyes accustomed to silence, letting injustice swallow its target. In that moment, Jordan remembered boardroom meetings, where he had to prove his design was not too ambitious, even when it saved hundreds of thousands of lives. He remembered fundraising days when investors looked at him as if he were an exception, not a genius. But never, not once, had he witnessed contempt This raw, this blatant, displayed openly, without disguise, without shame. Jordan clenched his hand, not with uncontrolled anger, but with calculated fury, focused, sharpened, contained. The kind of anger that waits for the right moment to strike back. He lifted his head, his gaze steady and deep cold, but unwavering. "I am the person who has every right to sit here," he said, each word delivered slowly, deliberately, with force. Linda laughed, a short, hollow sound, dropping to the floor like shattered glass. "Oh, sure." A long, suffocating pause followed, heavy as stone. If the world had a slow-motion camera, this moment would place Jordan at the center light, catching his eyes, still but burning, the stillness of a lake, moments before a storm. Linda tossed the ticket at him. It fluttered onto the seat like a shard of prejudice thrown straight at his face. "Wait here," she ordered. "I am calling the supervisor." Her voice tightened. "And do not touch anything." She turned sharply, heels striking the floor with dry, clipped thuds. Fake authority. The authority of someone convinced the rules always protected her. Jordan watched her go. His emotions began rising, building momentum. Rising tempo. His heartbeat pulsed sharper, but his mind only grew colder, clearer. He felt like a machine preparing to power up, not from fear, but from the truth demanding to be acknowledged. A young woman behind him whispered, "Oh my God, is this really happening?" A man answered, voice low and trembling, "Who does she think he is?" Another voice added, "Maybe he's on the wrong flight." But those who understood, those familiar with injustice, stayed silent. Their silence was ash from memories they had no desire to relive. Jordan inhaled deeply. He bent down to pick up the ticket. His fingers trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from restrained fury trying to break free. The ticket was intact, but Linda's nail marks were imprinted along the edge, a small aggressive scar revealing exactly who she was. At that moment, the aircraft speaker crackled faintly. Jordan heard footsteps approaching from the front of the cabin, quick and urgent like a storm rushing in. The supervisor, the cabin manager, or something worse. No one knew. No one guessed. No one imagined that the person they were trying to remove from first class was the last person on the plane they should have provoked. Rising tempo. Jordan's heartbeat synced with the approaching footsteps. When Linda returned, standing in front of him with her chin tilted toward the exit, as if commanding an intruder, she spoke with triumph. "You," she said, "stand up. Someone from the airline wants to speak with you." The plane plunged back into that thick, suffocating silence. No one, not a single soul, saw the twist waiting for them. No one knew that in just a few minutes the truth would overturn everything. And Linda was about to learn that there are some people you simply never insult. Linda stood blocking the aisle, the cabin lights casting upward, across her tense features, distorting every line of her face into a warped version of misplaced authority. Behind her, the supervisor had just arrived, Mark Delaney, tall with broad shoulders, his heavy steps carrying the certainty of someone who believed he was the final decision-maker on this aircraft. His gaze swept across first class, then locked onto Jordan, as if he had just discovered an intruder. No greeting. No open question. Only a judgment formed in the instant he saw Jordan's skin tone. "Stand up." Mark's voice dropped low, curt, impatient. Not the voice of someone seeking clarity. The voice of someone already convinced Jordan was the problem. Jordan didn't move. His eyes lifted slowly, his gaze cold deep, so controlled it made the air around him tremble with an invisible vibration. Half the first-class cabin, watched him, some tense, some curious, some pretending to read a magazine while holding their breath for every word. Linda cut in, emboldened now that she had backup. "I already told you. His ticket is invalid. He refused to leave the seat." And she added sharply, "He has been uncooperative." A hollow accusation, but enough to fuel the bias Mark had brought with him from the moment he stepped into the cabin. Jordan stared directly at Linda. That look made her freeze for half a second, only half a second, but enough to betray the fear of someone realizing she had pushed things too far. Jordan then turned his gaze to Mark, his voice low and sharp, like a blade freshly honed. "I am sitting in the seat I purchased." The cabin seemed to shift in its breathing. Every passenger heard each word clearly. It was not a defense, not a plea. It was a statement, a truth that required no permission. Mark tightened his grip on the radio strap over his shoulder, as if clinging to what remained of his authority. "To prevent disruption to the flight, we need to verify your information." "Stand up. I already gave my ticket," Jordan replied. She checked it. "There is nothing wrong with my ticket. The only issue here is how she sees me." Linda let out a small scoff, bitter and brittle, trying to prove she was unaffected. "Here we go again. I am just following procedure." A woman in her mid-30s near the aisle suddenly spoke up. "What procedure requires you to tear up someone's ticket?" Linda spun toward her with a glare, but the question landed like a spear through the mask of professionalism she had been clinging to. Passengers exchanged glances, quiet acknowledgments rippling through the cabin. Everyone knew this was wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to confront authority directly. Jordan rose to his feet, not out of fear, but because the suffocating silence in first class had created an invisible pressure, a pressure urging the truth to step out from behind everyone's avoidance. He stood tall, towering over Linda and reaching eye level with Mark. "What do you want?" Mark stepped back, only half a step, but every pair of watching eyes caught it. "I want to know who you really are," he said, voice tightening. "I want to know why the system shows a discrepancy with your seat." Jordan tilted his head slightly, his gaze fixed on Mark, his tone compressed like stone. "The only discrepancy here is your assumption. Your assumption that I do not belong in this seat." A soft wave of murmurs moved through the cabin. An older man in the row behind let out a quiet yow, the sound of someone confirming what everyone was thinking, but no one dared to say. Linda jumped in immediately, her voice pitching higher. "That is not the issue. The issue is that he refuses to cooperate." Jordan looked at her, as if he were looking at the shadow of a much older system, not a single person, but the structure, the habit, the small power carved out of bias. "I cooperate," he said, "when you do your job correctly. Not when you use your authority to obstruct me." Mark's face flushed. His authority was being challenged in front of the entire cabin. "If you continue resisting," Jordan cut him off. "Let me ask you one last time. You want to know who I am?" Mark clenched his jaw. "Yes." Jordan exhaled softly, his shoulders releasing as though he had finally decided what needed to happen. "All right. You will know." A white man across the aisle leaned forward, tense. A young woman quietly lifted her phone, not raising it high, just setting it on her lap with the camera aimed perfectly at the three figures. The cabin air tightened like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Jordan slowly took out his wallet, opening it with calm precision. No rush, no trembling, no fear. The movement of someone who understood that real power never needed to be loud. He withdrew a silver company identification card, its hologram logo shimmering under the cabin lights. He handed it to Mark. Mark took it, still wearing the confidence he had entered with. But when his eyes dropped to the laser-engraved words, his hand stopped mid-movement. Jordan Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer, Life Corps Medical Systems. A silence hit the cabin so suddenly it felt physical. Linda's heartbeat, if anyone could hear it, was pounding, because she had just realized that the man she believed did not belong in first class was the man whose medical technology contract worth $50 million her airline was currently negotiating. Jordan looked directly into Mark's eyes. No smile, no need. "Do you still want to know who I am?" First class erupted in absolute silence, the kind that says everything without a single word spoken. The man who had been doubted for the last 10 minutes was the one person they should never have doubted. And Linda, the woman who had torn his boarding pass in front of him, suddenly felt her legs weaken beneath her. Not because she feared Jordan, but because she realized she had opened the door to a storm she would never be able to control. Linda froze her hand, still gripping the edge of the seat, as if she needed something to hold on to, so she would not collapse. Every layer of false confidence vanished, revealing a raw, unfiltered fear beneath. Mark was still holding the CEO badge, but now his hand trembled, as though that small silver card weighed 10 times more than it had moments earlier. He looked at Jordan, then at Linda, then at the passengers watching their every move. Everyone understood they had picked the wrong man to challenge, and now the small space of first class had become a stage where every glance carried moral weight. Jordan remained still. He did not step forward or backward. He did not need to show power. Real power, when it truly exists, does not require anyone's acknowledgement. It lived in his breath, in the straight line of his spine, in the chilling calm of a man who had endured far too much and had never once bowed. Mark tried to recover his voice, but its tone had changed. The authority was gone, replaced by uncertainty wrapped in fear. "Mr. Mitchell, it seems there has been a misunderstanding." Jordan tilted his head, his gaze sharp as a blade just lifted from a whetstone. "What misunderstanding?" he asked, his voice low, but weighted slicing through every attempt at justification. "Was it a misunderstanding when your flight attendant tore my ticket? When she assumed I did not belong in this seat? Or when you walked in here and decided I was the problem before hearing a single explanation?" A young passenger in row 3 clenched her hands silently, as if finally someone had spoken aloud, the words she and many others had been forced to swallow for years. Linda opened her mouth, but Jordan raised a hand to stop her. Not with force, but with authority, an authority so palpable it made the entire cabin's chest grow heavy. "Do not speak. Any explanation now has no value." Linda swallowed hard, her lips drained of color. Mark stepped forward as if trying to salvage the last piece of control he had left. "Mr. Mitchell, I apologize. Let me check the system again." Jordan met his eyes. "The system has no issue." "People do." The sentence dropped into the cabin like metal, hitting steel, cold, sharp, impossible to dispute. An older woman whispered to the row ahead. Finally, someone said the truth that needed to be said. Jordan continued standing, slow and calm. His stillness made Linda tremble even more, not because he threatened her, but because she could feel the truth shifting toward him, pulling her off the ground she once believed was unshakable. Mark swallowed hard. "Mr. Mitchell, I am truly sorry," We will reassign everything for your comfort. A special service, a proper compensation package. We, Jordan, cut him off. I do not need compensation. I do not need wine. I do not need priority meals. I only need the same respect as any other passenger. That sentence made several people lower their heads, not because they were guilty, but because they had grown far too comfortable watching injustice unfold in silence, as if silence were the maintenance fee for a false sense of peace. Linda spoke up suddenly, her voice quivering. I did not intend to discriminate. Jordan turned to her. His gaze held no anger, which somehow made it more frightening. He was looking through her past her excuses and into the beliefs she had never voiced but always followed. Your intentions do not matter as much as your actions. Tearing my ticket, doubting me, humiliating me in front of everyone here. That says more than anything you can claim. A young man across the aisle lifted his phone, recording her expression as fear spread across her face. She turned away, avoiding the lens, as if it were an invisible indictment. Mark tried again to regain control, but his voice cracked. "Mr. Mitchell, allow me." Jordan looked at him with the calm of a judge waiting for an honest confession. Mark let out a long, heavy breath. "We misjudged the situation? Severely." Jordan said nothing. He did not need to. His silence forced Mark to continue. "We treated you unfairly, and I take full responsibility." Linda stepped back, as if those words were a sentence handed down to her. Her eyes darted around the cabin before settling on Jordan. But the challenge once in them was gone, replaced by fear, and the collapse of an illusion. She had clung to the illusion that someone like Jordan would quietly endure mistreatment. Jordan slowly sat down, every movement measured, controlled, as if he was setting the pace for the entire room. "Good," he said, his voice deep like a steel door closing. "Now you may begin doing your job correctly." Mark bowed his head slightly, a small action, but a meaningful one. The bow came from a man who once believed he held all the power in this cabin. A passenger behind them could not hold it in and began to clap. Another joined, then a few more. The applause was not loud, not unified, but it echoed enough to make Linda shrink, and Mark shut his eyes in shame. Jordan did not revel in the moment. He did not need to. He simply stared ahead, his eyes distant, as if looking through the metal shell of the plane, and straight into a society filled with unseen corners. A society where people like him had to carry proof of their worth just to be treated as human. Linda's voice trembled. Mr. Mitchell, yeah." Jordan turned his head slightly. "You do not need to apologize to me. Apologize to the people who come after me, the ones you would treat the same way if they sat here today." Those words dropped the cabin into a painful silence, a silence no one wanted to break. No one argued. No one denied. No one dared to speak another hollow word. Because everyone knew Jordan was not speaking only for himself. He was speaking for an entire generation. Mark stood frozen like a statue as Jordan sat down, but that silence was not an ending. It was a doorway opening into yet another layer of injustice, exposed under the stunned gaze of the entire cabin. Linda stepped back, but her legs trembled so violently she nearly buckled. She clung to the edge of a seat as if it were the last barrier protecting a position she believed no one could take from her. But what was shaking now was not her job. It was her belief that her authority would always prevail. A small-built man in the next row, hair streaked with grey, lowered his newspaper. "I have flown for more than 30 years. he said loudly enough for everyone to hear his voice, trembling slightly but sharp. And I have never seen first class turn a man into a suspect just because of how he looks. His words were not an attack. They were a confirmation of truth. Linda and Mark were not victims of a fleeting misunderstanding. They were products of a system that had been allowed to exist in silence for far too long. Linda opened her mouth to react on instinct, but Mark cut her off with a single look. He was not protecting Jordan. He was desperately trying to salvage whatever authority he had left. "All right," Mark said, his voice low, but shaking like someone who had just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. "No one wants this situation to escalate further." But his sentence only added fuel to a cabin already burning with suppressed outrage. A young passenger by the window spoke up. "You are the ones who escalated it." "Not him." Jordan lifted his gaze toward the young man and gave him a small nod. "Not a thank you. A recognition, an acknowledgement of an unnamed ally in a space never designed for people like them." Mark drew in a deep breath, trying to reclaim the control slipping from his grip. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his tone the strained voice of a man forcing down his pride, "allow us to rearrange everything properly and ensure you receive the correct level of service." Jordan answered, steady and cold. "The correct level of service for me, and the correct level of service for anyone who looks like me." Mark froze. 1 beat, 2 beats. The sentence hit directly at the truth. No one wanted to admit first class was only fair when passengers matched their expectations. Linda bit her lip. The collapse of her pride showed clearly in the trembling at the corner of her eyes. "I did not mean Jordan did not look at her." "Yes, you did," he said, his voice like frost. "Not accidentally, not misunderstanding. You acted according to the prejudice you believe is true." Linda's fingers tightened around her service cloth until her knuckles turned white. Her silence was not repentance. It was the crumbling of the illusion that this moment could be smoothed over with a simple apology. A middle-aged woman with glistening eyes leaned slightly toward the aisle. "It is shameful," she said softly, but sharp enough to cut through the air. "We cannot call ourselves a civilized society when things like this still happen and no one speaks up." Jordan looked forward, his gaze seeming to cut through the metal shell of the aircraft, seeing straight into the society beyond. It filled with shadows he knew far too well. Not the first time, not the 10th time, but a lesson repeated since childhood, through lecture halls, through boardrooms, through investment firm corridors, and now here in the most expensive section of a commercial flight. Mark turned the CEO badge in his hand, its cold silver reflecting onto his face. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, voice low and heavy, "we will report this incident to senior management. This is not the airline's standard." Jordan met his eyes. "You are right. This is not the standard. But it is the reality." Mark fell silent. Jordan had spoken the truth, that the airline would have to confront not as a scandal, but as a fact. A soft ding sounded from the cabin speaker, signaling the aircraft's door preparations. Instead of closing the moment, it tightened the tension in the air even more. A young man whispered to his friend, "This is definitely going to hit the news." His friend nodded. "I think it will become something much bigger." Jordan heard them, not out of curiosity, but because he understood. Moments like this always burst beyond the imagination of those who caused them. A small moment, a single action, but its impact spreads like cracks across tempered glass, wider, deeper, and impossible to patch with an apology. Linda stepped farther back, trying to hide behind the galley door, but every eye followed her. Not to humiliate her, to demand accountability. A responsibility people in her position had been excused from for far too long. Jordan slipped the CEO badge back into his wallet with a clean, precise motion. Not to flaunt power, but to remind the cabin of a truth he did not need to prove he belonged here. This space needed to prove it was worthy of people like him. Mark tried to stand taller, but his posture refused to straighten. He spoke quietly, almost like a confession. We will have to correct this." Jordan raised his eyes. "Not correct it for me. Correct it for the next person you judge based on how they look." No one replied. No one breathed too deeply. The entire cabin felt as if it had been forced to confront itself, to face the moments they had stayed silent in the face of injustice, to face the small prejudices they had allowed to live unchallenged in their minds. And Jordan sat there, not needing to stand, not needing to threaten, not needing to raise his voice. His presence alone exposed every hidden layer of truth this cabin tried to bury beneath warm, golden lighting. As the aircraft prepared to taxi, the air remained tight, the weight of moral gravity pressing down on everyone. They had just watched a man be diminished because of bias, and now they had witnessed the moment he rose with nothing but his dignity. A slight tremor ran through the aircraft as the cabin door closed, but the air in first class remained as tight as a metal wire on the verge of snapping. Jordan rotated his wrist subtly, adjusting his watch not from nerves, but because he needed a small gesture to keep every muscle in controlled alignment. He could feel every breath around him, every startled inhale, every sidelong glance, every stare fixed on him. They were not just watching him. They were watching a system being dragged into the light. The galley door at the front opened, and a figure stepped into the cabin. Not a regular flight attendant. Not a shift supervisor. This was someone whose presence altered the pressure of the entire space, as if the room had been pulled into a new gravitational field. Malcolm Reed, Regional Director of Customer Service, tall, polished with a face carved in sharp lines of authority, walked into first class with the decisiveness of a man who never wasted time. He did not look at the passengers. He did not smile. He stopped directly in front of Jordan as if he had known from the beginning who the center of this story was. Linda instinctively stepped back, her shoulders trembling as if a cold gust had pushed through her. Mark swallowed hard and jerked himself into a stiff posture, but Malcolm did not glance at either of them, not even for a breath. He looked at Jordan with the eyes of a man who knew exactly whom he was speaking to. "Mr. Mitchell." Malcolm spoke before anyone even inhaled. His voice was deep, layered, quietly, powerful, but absolute. "I have been informed about the situation that occurred here." The entire cabin seemed to collapse into those two words, the situation. No one shifted. No one dared clear their throat. Jordan lifted his gaze and met Malcolm's eyes. There was no hostility, no plea, only the mutual recognition between two men who understood. This moment was larger than a ticket, a dispute, or an aircraft. Malcolm inclined his head slightly, a deliberate gesture, rare and reserved only for the right person. "I am here to clarify everything." Linda opened her mouth, attempting to interject, but Malcolm raised his hand, a small motion that hit the air like a ceasefire command. The space vibrated with its authority. "Not you," Malcolm said, his tone flat as calm water before a storm. Linda froze, erased from the frame. Mark stepped forward half a step. "Mr. Reed, allow me to explain. "That will not be necessary," Malcolm replied without looking at him. "You mishandled the situation from the very first minute." Mark's face drained of colour, his posture stiffening into something brittle. But Malcolm did not pause to let him gather himself. He turned to Jordan, his voice sharpening, as if his words were being driven into the air with rivets. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to hear directly from you." Jordan did not stand. He did not need to. His voice was low and steady, each word pouring out like molten metal. "My ticket was torn. I was asked to leave my seat without cause. Your flight attendant assumed I did not belong here." He paused for a tight beat. Then her supervisor arrived and decided I was in the wrong before knowing anything at all. Malcolm did not nod. He did not react. But something in his expression shifted like a switch being quietly flipped. He knew this was not an isolated mistake. This was a pattern, a documented issue the airline had tried to bury beneath training manuals and generic ethics statements. But today it had detonated in the worst possible place, in front of a CEO with influence, and in front of at least 6 passengers filming the entire incident. Malcolm turned. Only now did he look at Linda. The single glance was sharp enough to make her flinch, as though cold wind had slapped her. "Miss Hawkins." He spoke her name without raising his voice, yet everyone listening felt their spine prickle. "You misreported procedure, misrepresented the situation, and misjudged how a service professional treats a customer." Linda exhaled shakily, stammering, I only followed my gut no." Malcolm cut her off. "You did what you believed you had the right to do." A young woman gasped softly. Her voice quivered like a string pulled too tight. Mark stepped in, trying to regain control. "We can resolve this internally." "There is no need to." Malcolm turned toward him, his gaze cold, like an unsigned disciplinary report. "Mr. Delaney, you chose the wrong side, in a situation where both ethics and procedure were clear." Mark went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Malcolm drew in a slow breath, then spoke a declaration, not to Jordan, not to Linda, but to the entire cabin, holding its breath. "Mr. Mitchell is a legitimate first-class passenger, and beyond that, he is the business partner our airline is currently negotiating with to secure critical medical equipment for our entire fleet." A small gasp rippled through the cabin. Linda's knees gave out slightly, forcing her to grab the seat beside her to remain standing. Mark blinked rapidly, like a man suddenly struck by headlights in the middle of the night. Malcolm continued, his voice heavy with finality. "The treatment he received today is a severe failure of our department. And I'm addressing it immediately," a man in the center row whispered. "This is the moment everything changes." No one argued. No one breathed too loudly. Jordan looked at Malcolm, not triumphant, not satisfied, just the expression of a man who understood that justice does not fall from the sky. It must be pulled out from the dark by the pain and patience of those who have endured long enough. Malcolm straightened his voice, deep and precise, leaving no space for doubt. "I will proceed with corrective action, right now." The cabin fell into absolute silence, every breath held as if an invisible hand was pressed against the entire room. Everyone understood the storm was far from over. It had only just begun. The air in first class thickened the moment Malcolm turned fully to face Linda. The white cabin light washed over her features, exposing every fractured edge of panic on her face, her eyes darting her hands, trembling her lips pressed tight, as if she were trying to hold on to a sense of authority rapidly slipping through her fingers. But there was nothing left to cling to. Not in this moment. Not under the gaze of nearly 20 witnesses. Not with her superior standing less than a meter away, cold, unyielding, and merciless. Ms. Hawkins Malcolm said his voice, flat not sharp, but weighted like a verdict being read aloud. "Do you have anything you wish to add before I make my decision?" Linda opened her mouth. A justification tried to force its way out, the kind she had relied on countless times before in places where she knew the system would always side with her. But this was not an empty HR office. This was not the quiet mid-cabin where no one paid attention. This was first class. The eyes of business leaders, attorneys, physicians, professors were on her. People with real authority. People with real influence. People who knew the difference between explanation and excuse. "I didn't think the situation was that serious," Linda stammered, her voice splitting into two tones, half pleading, half clinging to whatever dignity she believed she still had. "I didn't intend to offend him." Malcolm raised a hand. She fell silent instantly. "Your intentions no longer matter. Your actions have already said everything." Linda gasped the statement, branding her as plainly as ink on paper, and the entire cabin heard every syllable. An older man in the back row shook his head. "I saw everything," he said, quietly but audibly. This was not a misunderstanding. It was attitude. Professor Emily Zhao leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp as a surgical scalpel. Her behavior aligns exactly with what I study regarding racial bias in service industries. This is not an isolated event. This is a pattern. Malcolm gave a slight nod, the acknowledgement of an expert's confirmation, collapsing the last potential escape Linda might have hoped for. Mark stood frozen, pale as chalk. He knew that if Linda fell, he would be dragged with her because he had chosen to defend her at the worst possible moment. Malcolm turned back to Jordan. His gaze did not soften. True authority never needs to pretend a gentleness. Mr. Mitchell Malcolm said each word landing with the weight of a stone. "I apologize on behalf of the entire team, not only for Ms. Hawkins's behavior, but because our system allowed this to happen again." Jordan remained silent. He did not nod. He did not offer forgiveness. But in that silence, the cabin could feel that his anger was not the kind that flared and vanished, but the kind that remembered. The anger of a man who had lived this not once, not 10 times, but 100 times. And today the spotlight was too bright for the truth to hide. Malcolm turned back to Linda. His expression was no longer that of an administrator. It was the face of someone delivering discipline. "Miss Hawkins," he said slowly, "based on your actions, tearing a passenger's ticket, discriminatory behavior, humiliation, fabricating circumstances, and obstructing proper procedure, I am issuing my official decision." Linda stood motionless, her eyes wide, the whites starkly visible. For a moment, she looked around, searching for someone to save her, but every gaze avoided her or looked straight through her. No hand reached out. No voice defended her. The silence was harsher than condemnation. "You are suspended from duty effective immediately," Malcolm announced, "and I will be recommending the termination of your employment within 24 hours. Several sharp inhales rose from the nearby seats, not from shock, but from the undeniable correctness of the decision, a correctness seldom seen in similar incidents. Linda stepped back, covering her mouth. "You cannot," she whispered, her voice high and fragile, like shattering glass. "I can," Malcolm replied. "And I will." Linda turned toward Mark, silently begging, but he blinked. turned away, unwilling to let himself be pulled under with her. Mr. Delaney Malcolm continued, still facing Jordan. "You will also be subject to disciplinary review for mishandling the situation and making unfounded assumptions." Mark's shoulders collapsed like a wooden beam cracking under pressure. A young woman murmured, "This is the first time I have seen an airline address ethics properly." Linda shook, whispering desperately, "Please, I have worked here 22 years, and you have used those 22 years to believe you were exempt from accountability." Malcolm answered, his tone calm but heavy enough to make her sway. No one pitied her. Not a single person. Jordan remained seated, his eyes free of gloating or vindication. Instead, they carried a deep, steady weight, the look of a man reminding the cabin that what they had witnessed was only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. An iceberg people like him collided with every day. Malcolm straightened, his voice firm as a final ruling. "Our airline will not tolerate any discriminatory behavior, not toward Mr. Mitchell, not toward any passenger." The cabin fell silent, not from fear, but because for the first time in this entire ordeal, they witnessed a system correcting its own failures right where the injustice happened. Linda released her grip on the seat, standing unsteadily, like someone who had just fallen from a place she believed was untouchable. And in that moment, everyone understood truth does not always win. But today it did. Carmen, the flight attendant, newly assigned to replace Linda, stepped into the cabin with a calmness so controlled it felt almost cold. But that calm was not for the passengers. It was to keep the flight from exploding under one more layer of tension. She glanced briefly at Jordan, then at Malcolm, then at Linda, who stood trembling like a shadow, torn away from a place she once believed she owned. And in that short second, Carmen understood that what hung in the air was not an internal mishap. It was a turning point, a razor cut across a social truth usually smothered by warm towels, polite apologies, or compensation vouchers. Mark stood stiff beside Linda, but every ounce of authority he once wielded had drained from his posture. He was no longer the supervisor of the cabin. Now he stood like a witness to his own undoing. Malcolm directed a hard look at him, a glance sharp enough that Mark instinctively shifted aside, stepping out of the line of confrontation with Jordan like a piece removed from the board. Carmen Malcolm said, his voice flat cold, "You will take over this cabin immediately. Ensure the flight continues at proper standard." Carmen nodded, asking no questions, requesting no details. She understood, and she acted exactly right. She walked straight to Jordan's row, placed a fresh bottle of water on his table. A small gesture, but clear enough for every passenger to see the airline rebalancing its moral compass in real time. Jordan looked at Carmen, giving her a small nod of gratitude, not for the water, but for the respect. Malcolm turned back to Linda. His gaze was no longer angry. It was heavy, the weight of a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. Human resources will contact you. You will not continue your duties today. You will leave the aircraft when security arrives. Linda's breath caught as a broken plea escaped her, sharp and splintered like cracked glass. "Everyone is recording. Please, I have a family. I have small children. I cannot lose my job." Jordan closed his eyes for one brief second. He had heard that sentence too many times, in boardrooms, in hospital corridors, in moments where harm was excused only when accountability loomed. But he did not hate her. He only saw the truth laid bare, a truth impossible to take back. Malcolm did not waver. You had other choices. and you did not choose them." Linda collapsed onto an empty seat, hands covering her face. A few passengers looked at her, but no one moved to comfort her. Not out of cruelty, but because everyone understood suffering is not proof of innocence. The mistakes she made were not first-time errors, not impulsive reactions. They were patterns, habits, a misuse of authority repeated for years across many flights toward many passengers unchecked because no one ever recorded it. Today was simply the first time someone refused to stay silent. Malcolm turned toward Jordan, standing tall, respectful. "Mr. Mitchell, we will prepare a full report and contact your office immediately after this flight. Every step of the process will be transparent. Nothing will be hidden." Jordan opened his eyes and looked straight at him. "Good." His voice was short, sharp, cutting through the thin haze of leftover tension. A soft ding echoed from the cockpit. The captain's voice came through the speakers, low, steady, aware that he had just entered a space reshaped by everything that had happened. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing to push back and depart. Thank you for your patience." But the cabin did not relax. It did not breathe freely. The silence now carried a different color, sharper, aware, awakened. Everyone knew they had witnessed not just an act of discrimination, but the moment a man refused to let prejudice fracture his dignity. A young woman near the window touched her friend's shoulder. "He is calm in a way that doesn't feel human," she whispered. "If it were me, I do not know if I could stay composed like that." Her friend answered softly, nearly a whisper. "That is what they do not understand. People like him spend their whole lives learning to stay calm, even when they are the ones being harmed." Jordan heard them. He did not turn, but his breath deepened, not from anger, but from the sting of how true those words were. Malcolm left the cabin, his steps heavy but resolute. Mark remained where he stood, fists tight, knowing he had just lost far more than a shift. Linda sat, collapsed, trembling with each breath, no longer the one giving orders, no longer the one directing the cabin, just an employee forced to confront the truth of her actions. Jordan stayed seated, spine straight, eyes forward. He did not need to look back to know Linda was still crying. Not because he was cruel, but because it was no longer relevant. Her tears were not born of remorse. They were the fear of losing privilege. Carmen passed by, placing a napkin gently on Jordan's armrest. No words, no display. A simple gesture warm enough to soften the cold lingering in the cabin. Jordan picked up the napkin, set it aside. A man behind him spoke quietly. "I am going to tell this story to my son tonight, to teach him that he must stand up when he sees someone treated unfairly." Jordan exhaled slow and deep, like releasing years of silence he had been forced to endure. But he knew this was far from over. It had only just begun. And as the aircraft trembled lightly, preparing to surge onto the runway, the entire cabin understood they were not simply flying to another city. They were flying toward a different version of society, a version where the way Linda behaved no longer had a place. The Airbus surged down the runway, shuddered lightly, then lifted off the ground. Bright light flooded through the windows like a white curtain washing over a first-class cabin, still hushed after the moral storm that had swept through it. Jordan leaned back in his seat, the belt fastened firmly across his chest. His body was secured, but his mind wasn't still. It moved in many directions, sharp and cold, the mind of a man who had lived too long between two worlds, one that celebrated his achievements and one that saw him only through the color of his skin. Carmen began serving water. The air was still tight, but with a new layer, a layer of respect, of discomfort, of reflection. The passengers who had just witnessed the raw truth were now turning their hearts in directions they had likely never examined closely. Jordan opened his laptop. He intended to review his presentation for the important meeting in Boston, but when the screen lit up, he saw the reflection of his own face, sharp eyes, steady shoulders, tension in his jaw like he was preparing for another trial. He closed the laptop. He did not need the slides, because the real presentation, the one no one in his life ever wanted him to have to give, had just taken place in this cabin. A soft shutter sound clicked from behind him. A young woman looked away quickly when Jordan turned, but not quickly enough. Then she met his eyes again, timid but bright. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I just wanted to remember this moment. Not to post, just to remember that I witnessed something right." Jordan did not reply, but the sincerity in her voice kept him from feeling weighed down. He looked forward, though her face lingered in his thoughts, a younger generation carrying a glimmer of courage and clarity older generations often lacked. 2 rows back, a man flipped a page of his financial newspaper. His voice was low as he spoke to the person beside him. "Did you see his composure is worth more than 1,000 speeches?" The person beside him answered, "No. That is not composure. That is exhaustion forged into discipline." Jordan heard every word. Those observations were not compliments. They were accurate diagnoses of his life, a life lived carefully, breath by breath, to avoid being seen as a threat, even when he was only defending himself. Jordan opened his phone. The screen filled with dozens of new notifications, messages from Naomi, from board members, from reporters, from old acquaintances, all circling the same point. What happened had escaped the cabin. It was spreading across social media. The first notification read, "Your video is going viral. Over 1 million views. The tag, flying while black, is trending at the top." Jordan set the phone aside. He did not smile. He felt no victory, because he knew viral attention was a two-faced creature. It could become a tool for justice, but it could also turn his real pain into entertainment for 48 hours before fading away. Carmen approached her voice, gentle but firm. "If you need anything else, just let me know." Jordan looked up. "Thank you." Carmen did not step away immediately. There was weight in her eyes. "I have seen things like this before, many times, but never handled like today." Jordan met her gaze, his eyes deep as a dark well. "Not enough. And not the last time." Carmen swallowed. "I know." A cold current swept through the cabin, not from the air vents, but from the truth in those words, a truth everyone knew, but rarely dared say aloud. A cough sounded from the opposite row. Thomas Hensley, a seasoned businessman who had been observing Jordan with a measured, analytical gaze, leaned forward. "I read an article about your company, LifeCore," he said. "You are developing mobile dialysis devices, correct?" Jordan nodded. "Yes." Hensley pressed his palm lightly against his knee, the gesture of a man gauging the weight of his next offer. "I would like to speak with you after we land." Jordan looked at him, not pleased, not excited, but scrutinizing, measuring his intentions. "Why?" Because Hensley replied plainly, "I admire the way you controlled the situation under pressure, and because I believe your technology can save thousands of lives." A woman in front turned slightly and whispered sincerely, "It is worth saving." Jordan looked at her, and something softened in his eyes, just a little, barely visible, but there. and Linda curled up at the back of the cabin, like a character erased from her own story, trembled at every word. She was realizing that the world she believed she controlled had always been a fragile bubble, a bubble that had just burst in front of everyone. Carmen returned to the galley. Mark sat like stone, his expression stiff with the knowledge that a disciplinary notice was waiting for him on the other end of this flight. Malcolm did not return. He understood that the next steps were not for the cabin, but for the airline's executives and legal team. Jordan leaned his head back and closed his eyes, not to rest, but to gather the fragments of memory spinning through his mind, Linda's disdainful stare, the sound of tearing paper, the humiliation of being doubted, even while carrying the brilliance of a lifetime of work. His heartbeat slowed, but not gently. It was no longer anger. It was the cold clarity of someone who understood that what happened today, if handled correctly, could alter not just how this airline functioned, but could become a warning for the entire industry. The aircraft leveled off the seatbelt sign chimed off. Jordan opened his eyes. In them was something no one in the cabin could name. Not triumph. Not relief. It was the weight of responsibility, a weight people who face injustice never choose, but are often forced to carry. He touched the bag containing the prototype beneath the seat in front of him. Secure, undamaged, not ripped from him the way his boarding pass had been. A businessman behind him murmured, "I think we just witnessed something far bigger than an airline incident." Jordan did not turn, but he knew, and the entire cabin knew. They had not just climbed to a higher altitude. They were confronting a moral altitude society was long overdue to reach. The chime announcing lunch service sounded, but no one cared about food. First class remained heavy, with a truth that had not yet fully lifted. Jordan opened his laptop again, but this time not to review his presentation slides. Instead, he checked the wave of emails flooding his inbox. Subject lines rolled in like waves crashing against rock. "We support you. The airline must issue a public response. Do you need legal counsel interview today? Priority request." Jordan scrolled through the messages without expression, though his shoulders tightened slightly. Not from stress, but from the realization that what happened on the aircraft was no longer a small incident. It had become a record, a piece of evidence, a fracture in the wall of silence covering everyday discrimination society had long chosen to ignore. Professor Emily Zhao leaned toward him. "I uploaded the full video to my private server. No one will be able to delete it." Jordan looked at her, his eyes carrying a sharp gratitude. "Thank you. I did not do it for you," Emily replied, her tone even and clinical, like a research briefing. "I did it because my work has been ignored for too long. Today the world will have to see." Jordan nodded. No long speech was needed. This woman understood the issue more deeply than anyone else in the cabin. Several rows ahead, Mark sat, turned toward the window, gripping the armrest until his knuckles went pale. He heard everything. He heard the respect Jordan was receiving. He heard the quiet shame threading through each whispered conversation in the cabin. And he knew he would pay for this, not just with a disciplinary report, but with the reality that one moment of bias had put his entire career on the line. Meanwhile, Linda sat hunched forward, hands covering her face. Every new email alert on Jordan's phone struck her like another reminder that whatever she thought she could salvage was already gone. She didn't speak. She didn't dare. Each breath shuddered through her chest like an unspoken confession she was not brave enough to voice. Carmen returned to the cabin with a tray of water. She paused at Jordan's seat, placing a glass before him, a simple motion, yet full of respect he had never needed to demand. "Mr. Mitchell, the airline has issued an internal notice. Mr. Reed instructed us to ensure you receive any support you need upon landing." Jordan looked at her. "I do not need priority, just fairness." Carmen nodded. "Right now, fairness is something we are learning again." A simple sentence, but in this cabin it echoed like an act of contrition. A message from Naomi appeared on Jordan's phone. "Harper and Drake have seen the video. They say they respect how calmly you handled it. They will still see you at 3 o'clock. Jordan closed his eyes briefly. The meeting was still ahead. The work was still ahead. The mission was still ahead. But the weight he carried had changed. It was no longer just the future of Life Corps. It was the way society viewed moments that looked small, but exposed entire structures of inequality. In the row behind him, a middle-aged woman asked her husband, "Do you think this will make the news tonight?" The man answered, voice low but certain, "Not just tonight. I think it will change how this airline trains its staff, and maybe how people look at passengers like him." Jordan heard but did not turn. He knew change never came easily. A viral moment does not erase history, but it can open a door. A small boy in the row ahead kept glancing at Jordan, wanting to speak. Finally, he turned, fully hesitant. "Mister, are you a real-life superhero?" Jordan raised an eyebrow slightly. "No, I am just someone who does not want to stay silent anymore." The boy nodded, as if committing an important truth to memory. "I do not want to stay silent when I grow up." Jordan looked at him for a moment, 1 second, then 2, and in his eyes lived the quiet depth of a generation forced to be stronger than necessary, simply to exist. "Good," Jordan said. "Do not stay silent, but do not let anger destroy what you want to build." The boy nodded firmly, his eyes brighter than the cabin lights. An announcement flowed from the speakers, the captain's voice cutting through everyone's thoughts. "We are flying through calm air, expected to arrive on schedule." Calm. Yet no one in first class felt calm. They were re-evaluating everything they believed about power service and humanity. Jordan opened his bag and checked the prototype once more. The device lay still safe, the heart of Life Corps' mission preserved. He set it down, then looked forward. No one in the cabin knew it, but in that moment Jordan was not preparing only for an investor presentation. He was preparing for something much larger, a conversation society could no longer avoid. Outside, the sky was peaceful. Inside, an awakening was unfolding, not through shouting, but through silence and truth. As the aircraft began its descent, the cabin pressure shifted, but what truly weighed on everyone's chest was not gravity. It was the weight of a moment they knew they would remember for a very long time, the moment a man had been doubted, humiliated, yet rose with a quiet sharpness, powerful enough to make an entire system hesitate. Jordan sat upright, his hand resting on the armrest. He was not shaking, not anxious, only intensely focused, knowing that what waited ahead could influence the future of his company, and beyond that shape, a conversation hundreds of thousands would be having once this plane touched the ground. His phone vibrated hard in his pocket. He opened it. Messages from Naomi appeared. CNN, SNBC, Business Insider, The Atlantic, they are all reaching out. They want your comment on the incident. Stand firm. Do not let anyone distort the story. Jordan locked the screen. He understood. The world was waiting for his words, and whatever he said next would not only represent him, it would speak for those who had stayed silent out of fear of consequences, for those who had been treated as if they did not belong, for voices society had long ignored. Carmen approached with a slight bow of her head. "Mr. Mitchell, we have arranged for you to deplane first. A supervisory team will be waiting at the door. If you would like to avoid the media," Jordan met her eyes cool and steady as tempered steel, "I am not avoiding them." Carmen paused, then nodded like someone who understood something deeper than the words themselves. "Then I will clear the way." The tone sounded. The seatbelt sign glowed amber. The captain announced final descent. The plane tilted gently, wheels preparing to meet the runway. Jordan closed his eyes for one breath, not to calm himself, but to close a chapter. One he had not chosen but had been thrown into. The landing hit firm, but controlled. The cabin shuddered, once then settled into a silence so sharp it felt amplified. The plane rolled along the asphalt, the lights outside stretching into pale white lines. The cabin door opened. Light from the jet bridge poured in like a stage spotlight. And there, exactly as Carmen said, stood the press cameras, raised microphones, extended eyes focused, as if they were witnessing the center of a storm that had formed at 30,000 feet. Jordan rose, closed his laptop, lifted the bag carrying the prototype. He stepped into the aisle without haste, without trembling, moving with a gravity not of power but of truth brought into daylight. A passenger stood quickly, afraid of missing the chance to say what he felt. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you." Another followed. "You made me rethink a lot." A woman pressed a hand to her heart. "I am sorry I stayed silent earlier." Jordan only nodded. No blame, no absolution, just acknowledgement they had seen. And sometimes seeing is the first step toward change. Thomas Hensley stepped forward beside him. "After your meeting, let me schedule a private discussion." Jordan replied, "I will consider it." Hensley did not take offense. His eyes showed he understood that Jordan's real value was not the device he carried, but the leadership he had just demonstrated before an entire cabin. Jordan stepped into the jet bridge. The aircraft door shut behind him. A storm of camera shutters erupted, flashing like electricity. Jordan walked neither fast nor slow each step, closing the distance between him and the shadow of Linda, of mark of the moment prejudice had been exposed without escape. At the airport entrance, a small crowd gathered, not for autographs, not for photos, but to look at him the way one looks at someone who has done what they themselves did not dare to do. Naomi called. He answered. "Are you all right?" Jordan responded, short and steady. "I am." "And we will not let this be minimized." Naomi inhaled. "The meeting is ready. They are waiting for you." Jordan adjusted his tie, walked toward the waiting car, then said in a voice calm enough to chill, "Good. Because today we are not just presenting a technology. Today we are presenting a truth." The car pulled away. Boston rose ahead like a sharpened new chapter. As Jordan looked out the window, his eyes held no triumph. They held the awareness of a man who knew the road ahead had just become larger, heavier, and needed him more than ever. He was not simply heading to an investor meeting. He was heading toward a future he had been forced to represent, even though he had never asked for that role. We have just witnessed a harsh truth about society. Injustice does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it appears in a suspicious glance, in small powers, misused in assumptions that force a person to continually prove their own worth. But Jordan's story reveals something even more important. Dignity, when held firm in the face of adversity, can become the lever that forces an entire system to confront itself. And that is how real change begins. If you believe that respect is not a privilege, but a basic human right, press like and subscribe to help spread stories that push society into honest dialogue. Leave a comment with the phrase, "Stand tall," to affirm that you stand on the side of justice and dignity.